25 years and counting. Powered by cable. Washington Journal continues.
Joining us this morning is Kelly Shackelford. He's the president and CEO of the First Liberty Institute, here to talk about ideas of reforming the Supreme Court. Mr. Shackelford, you wrote an op-ed with the former Attorney General Bill Barr on FoxNews.com earlier this week, calling the proposal by President Biden dangerous. What did you mean?
Well, really, this is a continuation of a process that started as soon as President Biden came into office. They began looking at court packing and other ways to control the court because they were not happy with a few of the opinions. If you look at the court, for instance, even this term, almost half the opinions were unanimous. And really, if you look at the others that weren't, most of those weren't ideologically split. And so it's really a bizarre, kind of a hissy fit, I guess you would say, in a way, being upset with some of the opinions of the court and then wanting to totally change the structure of the court. I mean, we're talking about changing things. They're wanting to change things that have never been changed since the Constitution was passed. And these things that they're proposing are incredibly dangerous because many of them would really destroy the rule of law. And in particular, we would lose the independence of the judiciary, which is not only crucial, it's something the American people are strongly behind. The last poll we did on this last year showed that 91% of the country thought the independence of the judiciary was critical to their freedoms. And they're right. And the founders would believe the same thing, which is why they put certain things in the Constitution, like the fact that these federal judges serve for life. And so an attempt to change that is not only unconstitutional if you don't do it through an amendment to the Constitution, but it would wreak severe damage on not only the system of justice, but our willingness to accept that it's independent and not politically based because of the new system that they're trying to put into place. So it's a very dangerous thing. We can go into the particulars of them, but everything they're offering really, it would take a constitutional amendment. The only exception would be court packing, which they had bills in the first 2 years of President Biden's term, and they had a commission that was looking at that. And that just takes a vote of Congress and the president. But that would be incredibly dangerous. We've seen Venezuela and many other countries. Once you do a court pack, you really have lost your court forever. It becomes an appendage of the political branch of the legislature, and the independence of the judiciary is over. Whatever rights you think you have, you don't, because all the court would all the power, the political power would have to do is simply add justices enough to take away whatever right you think you have. So these things they're talking about are radical, and I think they would be incredibly damaging to our country.
What specific change would pack the court?
Any change that, all they would have to do is add, 4 justices. Again, in the first 2 years.
Where is that in the proposal by the president?
The new proposal, they've moved off of that. But I don't think these proposals they're proposing now, none of them are going to get through between now and the election. This is to push up the issue that their base has been very, very committed to. They want to restructure the court. They want to take over the court in certain ways. And the ones they're proposing, the term limits and the ethics, these proposals are things that really can't be done without a constitutional amendment. And so the easiest thing to do when they obviously know that's not going to happen is to pack the court, since that just takes a majority vote. And this was one of the major proposals that their commission was looking at. So that's, I think, where they're going to end up if they continue with this move and realize they're not going to get a constitutional amendment. That would take 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of the states. That's not going to happen. Now, I know some of these proposals, they said, for instance, they can do term limits in a sort of clever way by not specifically removing a justice, but by, putting them in some sort of different status. Even experts on the left, like Professor Chemerinsky from Berkeley and others, say, no, you can't do that. The term limits idea, it would run right against not only the Constitution, but many court cases going back, over 100 years, essentially, that said judges have lifetime tenure because of what is written in Article 3 of the Constitution. So this idea that they're going to somehow move the justices is not an authority that they have. They have authority over the lower courts. The Congress created the what they call the inferior courts, but the Supreme Court is in the Constitution itself, and they can't do those type of things without a constitutional amendment.
From the president's op-ed on what he is proposing now, a constitutional amendment barring immunity for crimes of former president committed while in office. As you said, this would take 2/3 of Congress and ratification by the states. Term limits for the justices, 18 years, and a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. That is what the president recently proposed. We're taking your questions and your comments on that this morning. Republicans dial in at 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. Text us with your thoughts at 202-748-8003. Confidence in the Supreme Court. According to an AP poll that was done in July, when they asked those that they polled about their confidence level, 44% said that they have some confidence. 40% said hardly any confidence. And 16%, only 16% said they had a great deal of confidence in the Supreme Court. When AP asked about the view of the Supreme Court justices, 70% said they shape law to fit their ideology, while 28% said fair and impartial. So, Mr. Shackelford, could these reforms of term limits and an ethics code help the view of the Supreme Court by Americans?
No, I think they would do the exact opposite. We have an independent judiciary, and if you change that, you're going to have the opposite result. Let's think of term limits, for instance, just as a policy matter. Really, what you're going to do if you do that is you're going to create political judges. You're going to create judges who are, number one, you're going to have this political process where the president is picking, two, I think this is a process that they're talking about each term, and it's going to be part of the political process. Additionally, think of justices who are not independent but are going out, and they know they're going out. Obviously, that would affect many of their opinions and their positions, because they're thinking of the job they're going to have next and who's going to be happy with what they're doing. And now they're courting favor with regard to their future career. The founders thought through all this, and they looked at these options, and they specifically knew it was very important for the judiciary to have this lifetime tenure. It's, you don't find anybody else in the Constitution with this, and it's a very valuable thing. Again, take ethics. The last thing we need is Congress having ethics requirements for the court that they don't even have for themselves, and having Congress controlling the court. Again, they don't have that control over the Supreme Court. But if they did, think of what that would mean. Let's look at what's just happened over the past month or so. You have Judge Eileen Cannon down in Florida, who is the federal district court judge who is over the Trump documents case. And recently, in a legal opinion, she said that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, was not appointed correctly because he was not approved by Congress, and that's unconstitutional. Now, people can disagree about that, and I'm sure on the Court of Appeals there'll be arguments going up. But it's a very well accepted legal opinion. In 1 week, and think about this, judges hardly ever get an ethics complaint for what they're doing, because they're not unethical in what they're doing. She had over 1,000 ethics complaints in 1 week. And it is obviously an orchestrated effort. And you think that's bad when we don't have these rules with the Supreme Court. Talking about politicizing something and creating less confidence in the court, it's a really, really bad idea. And again, I think it's just people who are upset with really just a few opinions of the court that are taking incredibly extreme measures that I think would damage the court permanently, if not lose the rule of law, some of the things that are being proposed.
Let's get our viewers involved. Ed in Wayne, Pennsylvania, Republican.
Hey, good morning.
Morning.
Can y'all hear me?
We can. Go ahead. Question or comment?
Okay, great. Well, I have a question. A comment and a question. I myself am a Republican, and I find it very interesting to hear Mr. Shackelford talk this morning, given his background. It seems very casual. We're talking about the things that would deface the court or lower my fellow Americans' estimation of it. But he doesn't seem to have any problem with the Federalist Society and his own organization's efforts to game the court and engage in court packing of their own. All of the things that politicize Supreme Court justices and make people lose faith in the rule of law that Mr. Shackelford has described this morning have been the culmination right now of a decades-long effort by our party, Mr. Shackelford's party, and my own, the Republican Party, that is, to control the Supreme Court. Nobody elected Leonard Leo. The founders did not anticipate a Mr. Shackelford or a Mr. Leonard Leo. The reason why it's so important for them to preserve the lifelong appointments now and to oppose term limits or ethics rules is because that would threaten their investment. Okay? Eileen Cannon.
Ed, I'm going to take your points and have Mr. Shackelford respond to them.
Well, I think the founders very much considered the process that we've been going through for the past, 200 years, over 200 years. The idea was the president was to appoint. The president is obviously an elected official. They knew that, that's a politically elected official. They knew the president would do that and that people would speak to the president about who they thought would be good justices. That's what's happened always in our country. Then the Senate would become involved in having to approve that advice and consent. So I don't think this is anything different. We've always had that approach. People have always, had their 2 cents to the president and said, here's who we think. And you would have different people under a Democrat or a Republican president. That's nothing unusual. What's unusual is trying to change the structure of the Constitution in somewhat of an experiment 250 years later, when a number of things that are being proposed, if you look at what's happened when you've done these things in other countries, you've really lost the court. You've lost the respect for the court. You've lost the independence of the judiciary. And it's something that I think if people could separate themselves from not liking an opinion here or there, but that would probably solve a lot of this. In other words, many of the people who want this is because there's really a few opinions that they don't like. That's a really bad reason for completely upending our structure and our constitutional republic that has served us so well for 250 years.
Okay.
And I think the American people will always be against this if you look at the specific proposals and you allow them, for instance, take the judicial term limits, which would, again, they're trying to get around it in some of the things they're saying, not doing a constitutional amendment. I think it clearly requires a constitutional amendment, but it's not even really an equal type attempt to have judicial term limits. It's, let's start by getting rid of the longest serving justices. So it's amazing that the first 3 justices that leave are the 2 most conservative, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and then Justice Roberts. That's not an accident. This is a partisan move to get rid of the more conservative justices on the court and replace them with more liberal justices. That's talk about politicizing the court, and this whole attempt is a partisan move. It's not something that came from both sides coming together and maybe setting something that would work in the future they think better for our country, which still I think is very dangerous, because I think the founders really thought through this well, and I think their system is the very best choice of those available.
We're talking to the president and CEO of First Liberty Institute, the largest legal organization in the nation, dedicated exclusively to defending religious liberty for all Americans, according to your website. Robert in Brainerd, Minnesota, Democratic caller.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I think your man you got on there is steering the public the wrong way. we're trying to get honesty in our judicial system. And at one time there was honesty, but you know what's going on now. They're accepting money, motorhomes, what have you. They're breaking the law. The law don't pertain to them. They work for the people. That's who they work for. They don't work for Republicans. They don't work for Democrats. They work for the people.
All right, Robert. Mr. Shackelford, you were shaking your head when he talked about the alleged ethical violations.
Yeah, this is one of the things I think has been so sad, is to see some of these extreme groups on the left fund journalism groups to run attack after attack after attack on justices. And the vast amount of those are beyond completely baseless. Probably the leading one is attacks on, for instance, like Justice Thomas, because he has a friend, Harlan Crow, and Harlan Crow has a plane, and he would go on his plane to like his summer home to visit, to spend a week. They're friends. The Judicial Conference did not require and say that you report that on the ethics form, getting a riding on an airplane with somebody. That has changed now since the controversy. The Judicial Commission has changed that, where it is now reported. But the idea that Justice Thomas did something unethical because he didn't report something that wasn't supposed to be reported is an example of the types of attacks that were occurring daily. We were collecting these daily from these groups that were funded by the left that were running these articles. They were sometimes averaging 25 articles a day across the country. And so when you beat on the court over and over again, and by the way, these things that they attack Alito and Thomas for, you have Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor and others on the left that have done all these things and more, and no articles written on those. So again, it's clearly a partisan. It's an attempt to lower the respect for the court, to delegitimize the court in order to then have more control over the court. And I think it's damaging to our country, and it's really unfair to the justices. None of these articles did you ever have the thing that we would all worry about, which is if any justice was given anything and then had somebody appear before the court that had given them things and then they didn't recuse themselves. There's never been a story on anything like that. And the justices, even take the justice they're attacking most, Clarence Thomas, because he's the most conservative justice on the court. I don't think anybody who knows Justice Thomas at all would think that anybody would influence Justice Thomas to do anything but what he thinks is right.
What about, though, this is Forbes.com in an article they wrote. There's an RV loan forgiveness. Thomas never repaid a substantial portion of a $267,000 plus loan from a wealthy friend. There's a Koch Network summit. Thomas attended at least 2 donor summits for the Koch Network, the right-wing political organization, and participated in a dinner with high-level donors without disclosing his appearance. It says that ProPublica also reported Thomas cultivated a relationship with the 2 Koch brothers through repeated trips to the Bohemian Grove, a private retreat for wealthy men. And then it says ProPublica reported that during his tenure on the Supreme Court, Thomas has accepted gifts including at least 38 destination vacations, 26 private jet flights, VIP sports passes, helicopter flights, private resort stays, and a standing invitation for a private golf club. You said other justices have done the same. What have they done?
Well, you've got Justice Sotomayor, who has, when she's gone to speak, has had people asking them to buy a certain amount of books for her to speak. I mean, you have all kinds of examples like this that have been laid out. I think there was a recent article by Judge Ho that lays out a number of examples and points out that these things were going on because there was nothing in violation of anything with them. And again, these rules that they're trying to come up with, the idea that you can't go and speak at an event if you're a justice, and then it's a matter of who's there at the event. You're not allowed to speak. The idea that you can't, and again, most of these, when they talk about plane rides, a lot of times they're talking about Harlan Crow, who's a very close friend of Justice Thomas. And it's never been an issue that you can't ride on a plane with a friend to their home or whatever else. This is something that congressmen do all the time. Again, it was not required to be reported back until just a few years ago. The Judicial Commission then added that. And Justice Thomas certainly has and will from now on report that, along with the other justices who never reported being on a plane with somebody to go somewhere for an event. It's common that people want justices to speak at events and come to events. And I think it would be a damaging thing for our country if the justices were all holed away. They're not even allowed to speak. I think they have great thinking. They carry a great history with the court. And if justices disagree, I think it's okay to talk about some of these issues in public. And I think that's a good thing for our country. And so trying to smear all of them and make them into like where they're on the take when there's no example of any such thing in any case, I think does great damage to the court. And it's all for political reasons. Again, it's all one-sided. And I think this is a really bad, dangerous approach where we're trying to partisanship our court. We're trying to make our court much more political. And so people will say, well, they're more political because of the opinions. I don't think that we've always had very controversial opinions where people are on both sides. In fact, if you look at the conservatives don't feel like three of the justices are really that strongly conservative. You're talking about Chief Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. So you've got disagreement all over the place. That's okay. But to then begin to smear the court and lose respect for the court for really baseless allegations like these, I think does no one any favors. And I think if you look at all the justices from the left or the right, these are people who come to their opinions because they really believe in what they're writing. They're trying to look to what the Constitution or the federal law says. Now, the one change that has caused a lot of this discomfort, certainly on the left, is really for the first time in the last 6 or 7 years, we have a Supreme Court who are originalists and who think their job is to find the original meaning of the text. And as a result of that, it's led to some changes in some opinions, certainly, and that's where some of the angst and some of the criticism comes. But that criticism is normal. Criticizing the judges is fine for their opinions, but then trying to go after them personally, their spouses, all these kinds of attacks, I think is really dangerous, and I think it's damaging to our country.
Let's hear from Frank, who's in New York, Democratic caller.
Mr. Shackelford, earlier you indicated that the current court is not politicized, but the poll that C-SPAN threw up showed that 70% of the population thinks that it is politicized. So really, you're just stating your opinion here. Everything I've been listening to you, and it's all just your opinion. And you're obviously happy with the decisions. You said that the decisions that were made recently were fair. Of course, because they were decisions that you agreed with. I have a question for you. Merrick Garland, what is your opinion? Or shape law to fit their ideologies, what you threw. Okay, so I read that as...
It's okay, Frank. Just go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, so my question, what is your opinion on the way that Mitch McConnell handled the Merrick Garland issue during the Obama administration?
Okay,
was that fair?
Let's get that question.
Well, the approach, if you go back for 100 years, what you find is that if you have a party if you have a Senate that is split from the president in the last year of a presidency, and a seat becomes open, then they've always waited because the Senate is a political body. Let's say it's Democrat, and let's say the Republican is the president. Then they wait and let the election determine if the people have an opinion on that. If you have the same party in charge of the House, of the Senate, and the presidency, the tradition has always been, and again, this is politics, that they would put the person through, that they would actually fill that seat. So that's what's happened. If you look at the past and you look through the examples, a lot of that's been laid out with regard to the court and what they do in the process, and it depends upon if there is a difference between the party of the president and the party of the Senate, because one appoints and one gives advice and the Senate has to approve. And so if they're the same party, they typically will fill the seat. If they're split, they'll wait till the election.
All right. Russell, Winchester, Virginia, independent.
Yes. I have always been of the frame of mind that the extreme right and the extreme left don't bother me with whatever laws they pass, because the court itself would keep things correct. But not with this court. This court is abjectly corrupt. Justice Thomas has been bought and paid for. It truly seems like the Federalist Society is telling these judges how to rule, not just picking them. And my question for you is, explain how the reading of the 14th Amendment can come to any other conclusion than the fact that Donald Trump cannot run for office, yet they allowed this to happen. Are you there?
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me start with something that's been said a lot. This idea that they're corrupt. I mean, there's no evidence that any justice has ever accepted anything with regard to any case that's come before their court. And if you look at, somebody asked earlier about the polling that was done within the last year showed that 70% of the country is against term limits because they see it as a violation of the independence of the court and the separation of powers. The reason you're having a lot of negative views of the court is because of all the massive campaign, the articles every day attacking the justices. Again, I don't think if anybody's really being fair thinks any of the justices is issuing any of their opinions except for what they really believe is the right answer under the Constitution or the statutes. You might not like the opinions. You can criticize the opinions. But, and an example just given, the idea that we take people off the ballot and not allow citizens of the United States to vote on the leading candidate of a party, that's an incredibly dangerous and wrong thing. The last time that happened was right before the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln was taken off 11 states' ballots. So I think what people are wanting sometimes with so much energy because of their political views would be incredibly damaging to our court and our country. I think people need to really sit back and think, do you really think these justices are issuing opinions they don't agree with? Or do you think that this is their judicial philosophy? They're trying to do their best under their approach to interpret what the Constitution says. And as a result, most of the time, they're agreeing with each other. Again, this term, 47% essentially of the cases decided were unanimous. And then you have really what's a small number of cases where there's vigorous disagreement and split along what people would consider more ideological lines. So again, I think this revving up of attacks and trying to delegitimize the court is very dangerous, because if we start tinkering with the court, I think we're going to want to go back to the wonderful system our founders put in place and has served us so well for 250 years.
Kelly Shackelford, you mentioned that in a poll you saw 70% of respondents said that they opposed term limits. Newsweek did a poll. They found that 58% of all surveyed said they would support term limits, while just 13% said they opposed it. The rest said they either didn't know or neither supported nor opposed it. Among the respondents who voted for President Biden in 2020, 69% said they supported term limits, while 6% opposed them. Your response?
Yeah, the poll I'm referring to, you can find, actually, we've got there's a website that lays out a lot of the history of changes to courts in other countries, what happens to those, but it also has some links to the polling that I'm referencing. That website is supremecoup.com, and it points out that in that poll they ask if people would want term limits, or if they thought that would be a violation or endangering the independence of the judiciary and the separation of powers. And it was either 69 or 70%, but they could see the poll right there that was done. So again, I guess some of these polls, depending upon how you ask the question, I think most people ask these questions have probably never thought through these issues. There have been some very extensive thinking, and when people read the arguments on both sides, they can make their own conclusions about this. But I think just the idea that we're throwing in changing our Constitution and our whole system of justice because people don't like a few opinions, I think it's a better approach to start to talk about these things and argue. And I know, for instance, some of these people, what Biden is doing is trying to change the presidential immunity opinion. And, it's the first time we've had to deal with that issue. I think most scholars have said through the years that the president doesn't have absolute immunity, but he has to have some immunity. If he doesn't, then, for instance, they could have prosecutors in conservative counties beginning to prosecute President Biden because of the negligent homicide of the soldiers in Afghanistan. You could go after President Obama for bombing some innocent people by mistake. Those become criminal, and the idea that you got to have some immunity. Now, maybe the court hasn't drawn those lines perfectly yet, but over time, then new cases come up, they will attempt to do that. And maybe it can be better, or maybe they did it exactly right. But this idea that because you don't like the opinion, we're going to change the whole structure of our court, possibly ruin our court, as has happened in other countries, I think is really the wrong approach. I think, if you're really being honest and you've met any of these justices, you know them, they have their judicial philosophy, they're doing their best to come to the right conclusion on what the law says, on what the Constitution says. And if you don't like it, let's have a public discussion about those issues, and let's see if we can, put more justices in the future on that go with whatever that approach or philosophy is. But the idea of completely dismantling and changing the court is a very bad idea, and I think would do great damage to our country.
Our viewers can learn more if they go to firstliberty.org. Kelly Shackelford is the president and CEO of First Liberty Institute. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Greta.
We're going to take a break. Up next, a conversation with a longtime advocate for reforms of the Supreme Court, Gabe Roth, executive director of the group Fix the Court. We'll be right back.
Saturdays, American History TV features historic conventions